We see the headlines every night. Another shooting in a Chicago neighborhood, another innocent life taken in the crossfire, another smash and grab at a local business, or a driver carjacked at a busy intersection. Thank you for joining us. I'm Stefan Holt. Whether you call it perception or reality, Chicagoans have made it clear they do not feel safe in their own city. So the question now, how do we make it safer for all Chicagoans? What solutions have failed us, and what do we need to try now? I'm joined by three men who served as the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department. Jody Weis, a 23-year veteran of the FBI, rising to special agent in charge of the Philadelphia field office, the first superintendent from outside of the Chicago Police Department in 50 years, serving from February 2008 to March 2011, and is currently a private consultant. Joining us from Arizona now today. Garry McCarthy rose through the ranks of the NYPD, became the top cop in Newark, New Jersey, and served as Chicago's police superintendent from May 2011 to December 2015. He's now the police chief in suburban Willow Springs. And finally, Eddie Johnson started as a patrol officer in the Chicago Police Department, eventually became a commander, chief of patrol, and then superintendent from March 2016 to December 2019. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. We see the crime numbers, we hear the rhetoric on TV and in the ads all the time, but I want to hear from you, the former police superintendent. Jody Weis, I'll start with you. What do you see as the #1 public safety threat to the city of Chicago?
You know, my experience is going to be gangs. Gangs have been a plague in the city for quite some time, and I think if you can address the gang problem in an effective way, I think you can get you can get the city much safer.
Garry McCarthy, what is the #1 public safety threat to Chicago?
It's hard to say which is #1 because it's probably a tie with about 5 different issues.
Sure.
Certainly the gangs, like Jody said, but the politics of Chicago, I think, is absolutely crushing the CPD, and at the same time interfering with policies. My first tenet to take that job was with Rahm Emanuel. I said, listen, I will keep your politics forefront in my mind, but I'm going to run a department based upon performance. And he agreed to it. Now, you know, I had to remind him that constantly, and it wasn't easy. Sometimes I had to argue with him, but 99% of the decisions that were made during my tenure, I made. And, you know, I picked who was getting promoted. I decided what the policies were going to be, and that's not happening today. Or I shouldn't say, it hasn't been happening, certainly for the last few years.
You nodded a little bit when Garry said politics.
Yeah, you know, I agree with both my former bosses, you know, in terms of the gangs and the politics of it. You know, like Garry just mentioned, you know, when I was superintendent, mostly under Rahm Emanuel, I have to tell you, he let me run the police department 100%. You know, he never butted in on any of the decisions or tried to implement policies that he thought should be. He left that up to me. And I think that the threats now, people just have to recognize you have to let the police be the police, because if you don't, then we run into what we have now. People mistakenly think our criminals are stupid. Now, we do have some dummies out there, no doubt, but a lot of them pay attention to what's going on in the politics of this city, and they take advantage of them.
Jody mentioned the gang problem. Here's another example. We came up with a gang violence reduction strategy that had that it was based upon data. We looked at who were the gang members, who were the turfs that they claimed, who were they in conflict with. So if a shooting happened here, we didn't send everybody here. We sent them to the rival gang turf to prevent the retaliation shooting. That was the most successful thing that we did under my tenure, I think, that really had an impact on violent crime. And the gang database came under attack politically, because, okay, some people were in there who maybe shouldn't have been in there, but by the same token, I'm not sure there was a harm to those individuals, but we were having great success in preventing the retaliation shootings. They were happening within 5 minutes of each other.
The idea of the gang database, and as you mentioned, there were some inaccuracies in there. I mean, there were several activist groups and even the Inspector General that had said some of this data was just not effective, or in some cases was even unconstitutional or racist. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I don't know how it could have been unconstitutional or racist. We weren't going after individuals, But if Garry McCarthy was listed as a four-corner hustler and I got shot in four-corner hustler territory, we would know who the four-corner hustlers were in conflict with and go to the geography. And that's how we were preventing the shootings. So not understanding the strategy leads to problems. And when people who are outside of criminology or policing influence policies like that, you don't tell doctors how to operate. You don't hire a plumber to do your electricity. So, years and years of experience, certainly between the three of us, and this happens across policing. And it's a problem.
I want to bring Jody Weis in on this because you were criticized during your tenure for actually sitting down with gang leaders. A lot of people chalk that up to as negotiating with criminals, but you've actually said this was a way that reduced gang violence. Could you explain that?
That kind of makes me laugh when I think back about the people who have no clue what they're saying, criticizing something that really worked. What we tried to do was bring in all of the gang leaders in a particular area, sit down, talk to them. And when we did that, we had pictures up on the wall of people who had gone to prison. And we emphasized the RICO statute, which is something I'd love to talk about later on. And we showed them, if you engage in this violence, you're going to go away for a long time. That drove a very strong point. There was no negotiation. There was no give and take. We brought in faith-based community leaders to help them out, give them some ideas. If you want to get out of a gang, here's something else you could do. And I think that's important to have that type of dialogue. But as Garry alluded to, and as Eddie agrees, when you have people that really work there and they don't understand the logic behind it, then you get involved and a lot of people come up with this naysaying attitude. And those programs worked very effective. In that particular area, I believe there was about a 45% reduction in violent crime right after that. And it sent a very clear message that we are going to come after you, we're going to do what we're saying, and we're going to use federal crimes and federal statutes, which will put people in jail for a long time.
Jody started that in Chicago. We continued it, and we expanded it.
So you would both sit down with gang leaders and talk to them?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And we would deliver a very clear message. There were three voices. There was the voice of law enforcement, where we said, if one of you steps out of line, there's group accountability here. And we'll do warrant enforcement, we'll do narcotics enforcement, we'll do whatever we can for the bad gang. And we tell them, I don't hate you. I want you to live a productive life. I don't want you to go to prison, but I'll certainly put you there if it's going to provide for the public safety. And then we would have the voice of pain with parents of murdered children who would talk to these kids. Some of them would start crying because they know people who were killed and so on. And then we were working with the Safer Foundation, who would offer them help if they needed, assistance getting off of alcohol or narcotics, if they needed to get a driver's license so that they could get a job. That worked.
It absolutely did. And then when I became superintendent, we continued it and then added a few more pieces, such as, I discovered, and I know that they know this too, when you have those individuals coming out of prison and they get back involved in the gang life, if you don't give them a lifeline to some employment so they can do something gainfully, because there's nothing like seeing one of these guys when they get their first paycheck and they come back to us and say, look at what I did, because they want to provide for their families. But I guarantee you this, if you don't provide something, if you don't provide housing and employment for those guys within 6 months, if they can't feed their families, then guess what? They're going to start doing what they did to get into prison. But I absolutely agree that those programs worked, and we saw the reduction in crime as a result of that.
We talk a lot about gun violence with the gang violence as well. Why does Chicago have such a problem with guns and shootings?
Because they're so easy to get in this city. They're easy to get. We border states that just don't look at gun transportation like we do. Politicians just don't want to look at the logical steps to take. They're just incredulous to what we actually need. The one thing that frustrated me to the nth degree as superintendent, because we all had to go to Springfield and lobby for certain stricter laws. But what really is upsetting to me is you will hear across the country, Chicago has the toughest gun laws in the country. That's a bunch of hogwash. It's not true.
NRA rhetoric.
It's not true. If it were true, we wouldn't see what we see.
I want to bring in Jody Weis because I see you're nodding to this conversation. What is your take on the reason why we have so much gun violence in Chicago?
I think it's a multitude of things, and I may differ a little bit with Eddie and Garry's point. I actually think Illinois has some pretty strong gun gun laws on the books. The problem is the judges don't like them. And when I talked to the state's attorney, I asked her, why aren't we charging this? And her answer was, the judges. The judges refuse to hear cases like that. You can have the greatest laws in the books. If you don't have judges who are willing to enforce them, it's not going to happen. And the judges, in my opinion, have gotten a pass for way too long. You know, everybody wants to point fingers at the men and women in uniform. That's easy. And people want to go to the state's attorney's office. But the judges, who are all elected officials, get a pass every time. And that's very, very frustrating. And I think the new mayor is going to have to work to kind of build a cohesive criminal justice system where the police, the judges, as well as the state's attorney, are all working together. It's going to take that type of leadership to create a culture where violence in Chicago is just unacceptable. And there's not one entity that can make it go away, but if people work together, I think you can see a huge difference in the cities.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
It's just not enough for a cop to arrest someone with a gun. That's just the beginning of it. And when you follow those cases through, you see that most of those guys the case gets kicked out eventually. So if the courts and the judges aren't in lockstep with the police department, it just is.
We invited the chief judge of the Circuit Court of Cook County to respond to the talking points of our conversation today. Their office did not get back to us before our deadline. You mentioned some of the younger gang members, and that's been a huge issue with the number of carjackings, vehicular hijackings in the city of Chicago. In 2022, 1,948 people were the victim of a vehicular hijacking, according to city data. It was worse the year before. 2,149 people were the victim of a hijacking in 2021. What do you tell people who are just terrified to drive in the city of Chicago? What do you tell people who are just terrified to drive in the city of Chicago?
Keep your head on a swivel. Keep your head on a swivel. In Newark, we had the same problem. And we started doing federal prosecutions. Guess what? It went away. It went away.
Yeah.
Can you do federal prosecutions, though, when so many of these suspects are teenagers? They're kids?
Now, that's the problem, because we did a lot of federal prosecutions, too, but the federal government isn't set up to handle juveniles, and so that becomes an issue. But I tell you this, if you want to prevent carjackings or bring that number back down, to Garry's point, people get jacked a lot of times because they're not paying attention to what's going on. You have to pay attention. So there are fundamental things we can do as a society, as a city, to bring it down. But the juveniles are a problem. But I also want to point out, too, a lot of the crime issue in Chicago, it's not just about the police,
Sure.
Citizens have to take some accountability for this, too.
So I want to get back to this issue of kids getting involved in gangs or kids getting involved in some very serious crimes that could change the course of their life for good. Is it the community aspect? Is it law enforcement? Is it social services? How do you get them to stop committing these crimes?
It's actually, I think, a combination of things. First off, it always starts in the home. I think that's really important. And the schools have to be involved. You almost have to create this culture that we are not, as a city, going to stand for this violent crime. Chicago has a very strong black faith-based community. You've got to get people really emphasizing what it is to be good citizens. Get to them early. Start talking to them about alternatives, as Eddie mentioned. Give them opportunities to go something else beside a gang. And when they get that first paycheck, that's legitimate, and they're not going to go to jail, and they're not going to wind up dead before they're 18 years old, might be a different story for them.
I want to get back to the issue of prosecutions because there's been a lot of complaints from the current administration of the police department, from David Brown, that the Cook County State's Attorney's Office is just not prosecuting a lot of these cases that are brought before them.
I can tell you this. While I was superintendent, Kim Fox and I had a great relationship, the two of us. However, the relationship between the ground troops was a little strained. And I have to admit, if the detective division called me and said, hey, we're having a problem with this state's attorney over here for whatever it was, I would give her a ring. And to be honest, she never let me down with that. She always took care of it. But, there were some times when we had some issues with trying to get a prosecution for something, and then not just getting the charging part of it done, but the whole process, ensuring that these people that commit these violent crimes are held to account. Because if you don't, the other gang members, they look at that kind of stuff and they say, whoa, wait a minute. we might have a free pass.
We're going to take a quick pause. We invited the Cook County State's Attorney's Office to respond to some of the talking points in our discussion. Here's what they had to say. Jody, Weis, let me bring you this conversation because I think we talk about the state's attorney, but getting federal prosecutions, getting the U.S. Attorney's Office to start taking on some of these cases, how does that work? How can we make that work?
Well, it gets people to make a commitment. I was really blessed when I was in charge of the criminal division in Los Angeles for the FBI, because Bill Bratton was the chief of LAPD, and we had a firecracker head of criminal for the United States Attorney's Office in the Central District of California. He would do a RICO investigation on 4 people. I tried to do that in Chicago, and all I heard was, oh, it's manpower intensive, I don't want to do that. But you know what? RICO is a pretty strong statute to use against these gang members. And they're going to go to 25 years of life. They're going to serve 80% of that, and it's going to be at a place far, far away from Chicago. And I think if you can get a United States attorney who's willing to invest in those resources, and I do realize that it does take manpower to do a RICO investigation, but you start doing those with the right messaging, and I think the gang members will start taking note of, like, hey, this isn't fun anymore.
We want to let you know we invited the U.S. Department of Justice to respond to some of the talking points of our conversation. Here's what they had to say. Jody, you mentioned manpower, and Adam, open this up to the group. Do we need more cops in the city of Chicago?
I always say that it's more important what they're doing than how many you have. And, that doesn't mean that we're not short. I don't know where they're deployed, but I can tell you this. We put the cops out on the beats. We went to geographical integrity, moving away from these big task forces. Mm-hmm. Because, I kind of thought when I got here that we had really 3 different departments. We had I answer the radio police, mm-hmm. because the guys and gals in the beats, that's all they could do. They couldn't do affirmative, proactive police work because they were just answering calls for service. Then we had CAPS, which was I make people feel good by going to meetings and kind of doing that. And then we had I do the enforcement police. Well, I think that, Johnson or Weis and McCarthy sitting in a beat car can be all 3 of those police officers. Mm-hmm. And I would know the difference between the 5 kids who are coming for basketball practice on that corner versus the 5 kids who are always standing on the other corner.
You kind of mentioned this idea, Eddie, earlier about getting to know people in the community, that the officer is almost an integral part of the neighborhood. Would you like to see more of that, too?
We do need more cops, because see, if you don't have enough and they're tied to that radio all day, that's all they can do. Mm-hmm. They don't have time to get to know the people in their communities. They don't have time to do proactive stuff. They don't have time to do officer friendly things because they're so busy answering the radio calls. So 1,400, that's not good. It's not in a city with 2.7 million people.
It's clear that police has a community relations problem. Do you ever envision a time when the community, especially black and brown communities, trust police officers? It's clear that police has a community relations problem. Do you ever envision a time when the community, especially black and brown communities, trust police officers?
Yeah, I do, but we're taking the wrong medicine for what ails us. What we don't talk about is victimization. Our victims are north of 80% African American. Now, the Constitution is written to defend the rights of the accused. We get that. But we have to have some serious discussions. You know why we have never had trust? Because apparently we're accountable for segregation, discrimination, redlining, the breakup of the family unit, poor education, and economic opportunity all at the same time. It's not just the police. Let's not forget that it's a law enforcement system. which includes prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and so on and so forth, sheriffs. All of these things matter. And if it's not a functional system, it's going to fail. And we get blamed for everything. So we have to have these discussions. And I used to have them. I used to love going to the South and the West Side and talking about this stuff. And you know, one of the things that I love is, you know, black audiences talk back to you. And I would talk about race. I would talk about segregation. I would talk about redlining. And they would be talking back to me, and I'd talk, you know, we're the most segregated city in the country. And that's right. And then I say, but then we insist on it, don't we? We want black commanders and black cops in black neighborhoods. We want Hispanics in Hispanic neighborhoods. That's not going to build trust. What's going to build trust is having the conversations.
I'll push back on one thing. The trust issue in the black neighborhood is not that it was never there, because certain portions of the black neighborhoods in black Chicago do trust the police. They do. Problem is, in my opinion, the minority that don't trust the police are the loud ones. That's who you hear from all the time. And I can tell you this, I never went in one black or brown community that didn't say they don't want the police there. What they did say, though, was that we want the police to treat us fairly and respectfully. And I think that's a valid ask,
Sure.
because that's how we should treat them.
But that also almost puts the police where they have to be almost beyond reproach, where you have to be on your A game every single
You should
day.
be. You should be.
That's what we want. That's what we expect.
The other thing I wanted to just mention about that is, you know, you get some of these so-called experts and statisticians, and they look at the arrests and they say predominantly, it's African-American young men that are being arrested. What they never look at are the victims that are being called in, which, as Garry said, is predominantly African-American victims. So who are the police going to respond to? They call 911. They go into the south and west sides of Chicago and they make arrests. But these folks who claim to be the experts never look at, well, who's calling the police? Who are the real victims? And the message keeps getting out like the police are racist, whether they're black or brown or white, doesn't matter. It's just systemically racist. And it's just not true. And I do think law enforcement needs to do a better job. I know I could have done a better job in terms of getting the message out.
I want to build on this a little bit, because this is something that we never have an opportunity to talk about. We only get to talk in sound bites, right? But in 2015, the issue of stop and frisk blew up across the country, and it certainly was coming to Chicago. And my press guy comes to me and says, hey, boss, what are we going to do about this? Because they're going to come after you because you came from New York. I said, we're going to do analysis. He says, why? I said, because I want to show people that we don't stop people, we don't arrest people based on population demographics, which is the standard that's being used by the Department of Justice to say that there's racial profiling. That's the standard they use. We're going to do the analysis for 2013 and 2014. And guess what? In every one of the 77 communities in the city of Chicago, who, when, and where we stopped and arrested was within 1 or 2 percentage points of A, arrest data, and B, offender description by the victim. Yeah. Take Englewood, 90-something% African American. We're going to stop 32% white guys there? A, that one guy would get stopped a lot, but B, that's profiling.
I know there's an Inspector General's report that talked about the number of police officers that stopped people in use of force. There's Office of Inspector General. More than 83% of those incidents that led to use of force involved a black person. I think this perception of a pattern that this happens over and over again, and it might not be causal, it might not be bias related, maybe it is, but I think the sense that people feel like this is happening over and over and again. What do you say to that?
I don't want to simplify this to this level, but if an officer violates the law, if they use excessive force, they need to be prosecuted. If they violate policy, they need to be disciplined or retrained. That's it.
Does that happen enough in the police department right now, where officers do face discipline?
Now it's getting overdone.
Overdone. Does that happen enough in the police department right now, where officers do face discipline?
Now it's getting overdone.
Overdone.
If we're going to be a legitimate organization or legitimate profession, we have to have internal legitimacy, which is free of the politics.
No, I agree. It's a difficult thing in Chicago, the politics of how we do things. I remember testifying in Springfield. We have like 7 oversight committees for the Chicago Police Department.
Sure, we just added 2 more levels.
And it's insane. You think about this for a moment. I know all 3 of us have tried to fire police officers that should not be Chicago police officers, only to get our recommendation overturned by the police board. And it's frustrating because, to Garry's point, if a cop violates the law and they engage in egregious behavior, they should be fired and sent to prison if what they did constitutes that. However, if they make a mistake, then they should be retrained and disciplined accordingly, but they should not be subject to prosecution because mistakes happen. I tell people all the time, if you make a mistake while you're working at Samsung, somebody's TV doesn't work. But if you make a mistake in law enforcement, unfortunately, somebody could lose their life. That does not mean that officer came to work that day saying, I'm going to kill someone.
Sure.
They made a mistake because of the circumstance of events that happened leading up to that.
But how do you draw that distinction? I guess that's
Stefan,
where...
I just want to... Eddie just said something that's really important that I don't think people realize. We were trying to fire bad cops, and 75% of my tenure got overturned until, I'm going to give Lori credit for something, when she took over the police board, the discipline system was more in tune with my recommendations. Who does the investigations into those uses of force that you're talking about? When I was there, it was IPRA. Today, it's called COPA. Okay? So the police superintendent doesn't have the investigations. The police superintendent can't discipline the officers, yet we're accountable. We have accountability without authority. That's a failed business model, but that's the structure of the Chicago Police Department.
You wouldn't go into a surgeon's operating room and tell them how to do the operation, right? People want to tell the police how to do their business. That, don't get me wrong. We know the history of the racism in Chicago, in particular in terms of the relationship with black and brown communities and the decades of mistreatment. We know all of that. But at some point, we have to give law enforcement and the police department the opportunity to fix a lot of that. But all the oversight, I think, retards what we really want. Because most of the time, when you look at it, Stefan, the activists in the black and brown communities and the police department, we all want the same thing.
Sure.
We just take different roads to get there.
Let's take a brief pause. We invited the Chicago Police Board to respond to the talking points of our conversation today. Here's what they had to say. Clearly, there's a morale issue within the Chicago Police Department. In particular, and Eddie Johnson will bring this up because you took over in the days after in the year after the Laquan McDonald shooting. That's when we saw a big rise as well in murders and shootings,
right,
and this dip in morale in the police department. It seems like there's a relationship between the two.
There is. So what I had to do was 2 things, because the police felt like they were under a microscope because of that shooting, of course. So I had to not only go out in the communities to try to repair that trust, which was a gargantuan task. Every day till 10, 11 o'clock at night, I was out there, especially that first 8 or 9 months that I became superintendent. Mm-hmm. But the other piece of that is then you have to gather police. I did it in a town hall structure where we would go to different parts of the city and gather 200 officers together, and we would just have candid conversations. But what happens is that once you talk to those police officers and get to know what their fears are, and then you can get the mayor on board with it, because it's just not about the superintendent. We can tell the rank and file what the mayor thinks till the cows come home. But until that mayor actually goes and speaks to them personally and let them speak back to him or her and tell them what they're really looking for, they have to know that there's some support. And every time they make an honest mistake, they're not going to be looking at prison. That's important for them, because at the end of the day, they're people like the rest of us, and they have the same trials and tribulations. Think about this for a moment. These cops in Chicago, we ask them for 8 hours a day to go out there and solve everybody else's problems, right? You don't think they have those same issues when they get home? The answer is they do.
Sure.
Because they're just Chicagoans just like everybody else. And we should hold them to a higher standard. That's what we expect from them. But if we want them to be the best, we got to treat them like the best. And, and part of that is getting them the support, the training, and the equipment that they need to really, do the job the way we want them to do. But at the same time, if we're living in an anti-police culture right now across this country, it's difficult to tell these police officers, we have your back, when they see on the news, blah, blah, blah. So it's important for the superintendent and the mayor to just not talk the talk, but you got to walk the walk. But as police superintendents, we still have to look at all the facts, not jump to conclusions, and then render a decision. And sometimes that's just not what the public wants to hear. Now, on the other hand, I know I was like this, and I know both of them were. If I saw a cop do something that was in clear violation, you can't hold that badge, because you make all of us look bad when you do those types of things. So Chicago just doesn't have the system where the police superintendent has the authority to really hold these officers accountable the way we want to.
Morale is so important in my mind, and I think leadership matters, and we all know that. And, during my tenure, and I'm not bragging because these guys are great, don't get me wrong, we had less crime. Every year, complaints against our officers went down. Police-related shootings went down by something like 41%. Complaints against cops were down something like 37% over my tenure. We made less arrests and got better results. Aren't those the outputs that we want from a police department? Well, the Department of Justice, during my tenure, was coming to Chicago and bringing people here from across the country to learn what we were doing, to take those things back to their departments because we were having that type of success. And then one incident blew up everything. Because now the very same Department of Justice that was bragging about what we were doing and supporting it and bringing it to other departments across the country suddenly came here and castigated everything that we were doing. Now, that affects officers.
Sure.
In a big way.
It's funny he mentions that, because I can remember after the Department of Justice did it came out with the patterns and practices that we were abusing our power. I never forget when we decided to roll out those body-worn cameras. So we initially went out to the rank and file to pitch the body-worn cameras. And in my opinion, when I initially looked at it, I loved it, because I thought that was a way to tell our side of the story.
Sure.
Okay, so we go out and pitch this idea about the body-worn cameras, and they didn't have a choice in it. They were going to have to do it whether they wanted to or not. But I will never forget that first district we went to. They were like, I don't want nothing to do with this. Within 2 months, I went back over there to that district, and I had officers telling me I won't leave home without this thing now, because they had to see it to believe how it actually did help them.
The past couple of years have been bad for those men and women, and there's got to be a big investment in leadership, in equipment, in training, anything they need. And it's got to come not only from the superintendent, but it's got to come from the mayor, it's got to come from the state's attorney, and it's got to come from the judges. And if you can get that, in my opinion, will boost morale.
We want to let you know that we did reach out to COPA, the Citizen Office of Police Accountability, to get their response to some of the talking points of this conversation. Here's what they had to say.
COPA doesn't just come to be on its own. It comes out of the Department of Justice report, examining policing in Chicago, examining the accountability systems and the failures in accountability that occurred prior under independent police review authority and beyond. Having that independent investigation be separate from and removed from the Chicago Police Department and led by civilians is a really key component to the authority that we have as an agency. And this isn't a model that you just see in Chicago, but each and every superintendent under COPA and any other agency that existed before has always had the authority to weigh in on those recommendations. It's not just unfettered access and decision making that we have as the investigative body. We have to make a recommendation that ultimately has to be accepted or rejected by the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department. And when you look at the data surrounding our recommendations, we agree far more than we disagree on most of these cases. Out of the around 1,000 cases that we closed last year, the disagreements between COPA and the superintendent were far less than 50. But really what I want to make sure that the public understands, and ultimately, speaking directly to any future superintendent, understanding the importance and legitimacy of civilian oversight in policing is of critical public safety importance.
This is a great conversation. I really want to get to the point now about the plans for the future. We're going to have a new mayor. We're going to have a new police superintendent. Of course, public safety is the #1 issue in the race for mayor in Chicago. Brandon Johnson and Paul Vallis both have two very distinct plans when it comes to stemming violent crime in Chicago. I'd like you to talk about the pros and cons of their ideas, starting with Brandon Johnson. Here's what he had to say at a forum hosted by NBC5 and Telemundo.
The public safety plan that I have is going to promote, train 200 more detectives so we can actually solve crime and then alleviate the pressure from law enforcement for having to behave as social workers, counselors, and marriage therapists.
This is sensitive. Some of it is okay. Listen, you have to let the police be the police. You really do. And, police need to know that they have a mayor that supports them. You talk about training 200 detectives to help with the crime rate. That's all well and good, but I'll give it to you like this.
It's taking 200 out of patrol.
That you're taking 200 out of patrol, so you have to put those people back, and then you can promote detectives, but they don't know how to be a detective just like that.
Sure.
Like for instance, if they're doing homicides, it's going to take them some years to learn how to do that. So that's not a quick fix. ShotSpotter, I can tell you unequivocally, the technology and the analysis helps with these crimes, because this is what ShotSpotter did for us. Imagine you're in your home and you hear a gunshot, right? You might not know which side of your house it came from, but you heard a gunshot. Mm-hmm. So a cop comes over there, knocks on your door, and you say, "Hey, officer, I heard a gunshot." ShotSpotter puts us right there, because now they know which side of the house it occurred on. They can go knock on your neighbor's door to make sure everything is okay. So those systems hurt. Now, standing alone, is that a magic bullet? No. But everything that you do with technology, along with the databases, for instance, the gang database, there needs to be some tweaking with that thing, because you don't want.
But don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Exactly. You don't want to.
So
If you have a problem with it, fix it. You can't do data. You can't make a plan if you don't have information. You can't make a plan, and you can't do data-driven policing if you don't have data. And I already told you how we were able to preempt shootings using the gang data information. If there's a problem with it, you fix it. You don't throw it out. I'm sorry, Eddie.
That's okay, but I think that I don't know who he's speaking with, but I think that any of us would be able to.
Somebody who wants to be a detective.
I think we'd be able to convey to him which direction, that the police department should go in. Because from what I know of him, he seems to be open to listening. Mm-hmm. So I don't know where he's getting that information from.
What's his reason for getting rid of ShotSpotter is what I'm curious about.
Well, and there are activists who also want to get rid of ShotSpotter. It's a $33 million contract that the city has. Of course, the technology will pinpoint where gunshots are in the city, but they argue, number one, it doesn't prevent crime, and that it changes officers' behavior when they respond to a ShotSpotter call. And an example would be the Adam Toledo shooting. Those officers were responding to a ShotSpotter call.
So let me ask you this. Should we just wait and respond to the 9/11 call 5 minutes after the shots are fired? Because that's what's going to happen. We're getting immediate information, which gives us an opportunity to intercede in somebody dying.
Listen, it was never designed to prevent crime.
Right.
It was designed to get us there quicker. Because I know while I was
to prevent the next crime.
exactly,
To prevent the next one.
So essentially, does it save lives then?
Because, listen, we actually caught offenders at the scene several times because of ShotSpotter. So it does help. Is it going to do that every time? No. But it points you in the right direction. So to just get rid of it is just...
Jody Weis, let me bring you in on this. The conversation about ShotSpotter. Brandon Johnson also saying he wants to recruit, train, and promote 200 new detectives from the existing rank and file. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's great to have more detectives because people investigating the crimes, you can then maybe get the people who are actually pulling the triggers, doing the robberies, doing the raping off the scene. But as my former colleagues just said, where are they coming from? Now you're taking 200 people off, out of patrol. If you want to look at the $30 million contract are you getting your money's worth? That's a viable question and maybe a good discussion to have. But to say it's not working, I mean, if you catch just a handful of people from that, they're the ones that are pulling the triggers. And when you fire a gun in the city, nothing good is going to happen from that. So if you've got a system that can help take shooters off the street, why would you want to get rid of it for other reason other than perhaps financial?
That leads us to our next candidate. Let's talk about Paul Vallis's plan for public safety. Here's what he had to say in our forum.
We need to return to community-based policing where we have beat integrity. We also need to return to community-based policing where the CTA platforms and the CTA stations and the trains have the presence of police officer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to the point we made earlier, when cops get out there on the beats, they get to know the communities that they're, patrolling. And that can never be a bad thing. That's always a good thing. And getting the officers' ranks back up, the numbers, it's important because in a city like this, as big as it is, and the issues that we have, don't get me wrong, you don't want to get crazy, but I think 13,000 somewhere in there is a pretty sweet spot for a city this size and the crime issues that we have. Because trust me, I wish we didn't need the police in this city. I really do. But the simple reality of it is we do.
Your message to the new mayor, what does CPD need from the 5th floor of City Hall? What can they do differently?
Put the right people in the right seats and let them drive the bus. And I got to tell you, Stefan, I think it's going to be really difficult to recruit quality candidates because the job is just getting harder and harder and harder. And, I don't know what the talent level is out there today and who's going to want to come here under these conditions and try and turn this place in the right direction.
Well, I can think of several big departures from the CPD in the last year or so. Brendan Denahan, who was the chief of detectives.
One of the hardest working, most talented guys. It says something when they leave. I'm sorry to interrupt. I keep doing it.
Sure. No.
When somebody like Brendan leaves the department 2 weeks before a mayoral election, when that's a guy who should be looking at getting the top job.
You know what, let me tell you this, Stefan. So, because I came up through CPD, I have a unique view. My time coming up through the ranks, you never saw people that made it to the rank of chief in their early 50s leave the department. You had to drag them out, man, until retirement age. So the fact that you saw all these people leaving 55 or under, it says something. Something wasn't quite right there. Those should be the people coming up now that should be taking the reins of the department over. So now you're left with a really thin bench.
Yeah, the bench was wiped out.
So let me ask you this, and Jody Weis, I'll ask you this as well. Show of hands, if you were picked by the commission or by the next mayor to do the job again, would you do it? Show of hands, if you were picked by the commission or by the next mayor to do the job again, would you do it?
Yes.
You would do it?
Absolutely. It's too important. And you probably sense my frustration watching what's happening. I can't help it. I'm frustrated by nature.
Jody Weis, would you do the job again?
No, I think my time has probably come and gone. I'm 65 now. I'm enjoying life in the desert. Could I help in some way in a consulting role or give some guidance? 100%. That's what I do right now. But, I think I'd have the energy for it. It's just like right now there's other things in my life that I'd like to explore doing. So I'd probably take a hard pass on that.
Eddie Johnson.
Because I see the situation, and I love this city, and I love the department, I'm conflicted about it. But the short answer is yes, I would do it. But I don't know if I could commit to 4 years of it. But I would certainly entertain doing it for a period of time to try to get things back on the right track. Yes, so yes.
See, I just gave you an emotional response, too. You know, my wife and children would probably dissuade me.
Yeah, you might want to run that by that trial attorney.
I know, right?
Double check that first.
Yeah.
But I think in all fairness, for the person who is going to take this job, what advice would you give to them about their expectations, their performance? What do they need to know before they step into that job?
I would say in terms of expectations, take it slow. You know, a gradual decrease is better than no decrease, and certainly better than an increase. Mm-hmm. I would also tell them, get out into the community, build those relationships, and also, as important, your rank and file need to know who you are. They need to absolutely know who you are.
So actually get out there,
get out there, talk to them. Yep, show them that you support them.
Mm-hmm.
The best conversations I had with the police officers were at 4 o'clock in the morning on street corners in Englewood and West Lawndale. I think leadership is critically important. Mm-hmm. This department needs leadership right now. The city needs leadership. And be prepared to get spun in all different directions and stay true to whatever your plan and your mission is. Stay true to it. You know, take advice, but don't change course.
The most important thing is probably to try to build morale up in the department. I agree with Eddie. You know, the crime will take care of itself, but I think the men and women have to feel that they are supported. And I would build that support, you know, publicly with the mayor's office, with the state's attorney, with the courts, to really show that you're behind the men and women in this department. I think right now they've been pretty much abused for the past couple of years. And get out and talk to them. Go to every district, go to every roll call. Try to find out what they need to do their job, and then deliver. I put the men and women in the department first, and then work outward from there. But really, really commit at this point in time for what's happened in the past several years. Really commit to supporting the police officers 100% without fail.
As we wrap things up, I want to just get your final thoughts now on what is it going to take to make people feel safe again in the city of Chicago.
It's going to take leadership, and it's going to take a plan, and it's going to take somebody with the backbone to stand up and do the right thing. I mean, you know, people's lives are at stake. This is really important, and that I've always found that fulfilling in policing. You know, we're not putting widgets out. You know, mm-hmm. we're saving lives. And that has to be recognized, and somebody needs to come in, make those decisions, come up with the plan, look at what's worked, what hasn't worked, and move the city forward, and not just address the crime, but the fear of crime. Right now, the fear of crime is through the roof.
The fear of crime?
Yeah.
Are these somebody, I think, like, you know, graffiti, vandalism, things like, or just the worry that something bad can happen?
The cars going in circles, sure. Disorder, right? All of that stuff matters. All of that stuff matters.
Eddie Johnson, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Garry made a lot of good points. Transparency in what we're doing and why we're doing it is important to the communities that we serve, because they don't want to just feel like you're beating them upside the head with things. They want to know why and how you're doing things, and that makes them feel more comfortable with it. Because let's be honest, you can talk about the numbers all you want to, but if people don't feel safe, the perception of crime, like to Garry's point, the fear of crime, it's huge.
Jody, Weis, this fear of crime and trying to make people feel safe again, what are your thoughts?
You know, I think you got to do three things. Number one, I think you've got to invest in the officers, make sure they feel supported, make sure they're equipped properly, trained properly, so that they can go out and do their job. That the leadership of the city, the department, the community really has their backs. Number two, I think you've got, as Garry mentioned, really look at what you're doing, what has worked, what isn't worked, what's worked in the past, what can you bring back. Make sure there's an accountability and transparency in everything you do. And then finally, I think you've really tried to bring the entire city together so that there's a culture that just says we will not allow this violent crime to capture the city. We don't want to be the national poster child of crime in a city. If you don't feel safe, then it doesn't matter what the numbers show. There's got to be a perception that I'm safe when I walk down the streets of Chicago. And that's going to take a little bit of work.
Hopefully ways to move our city forward and ways for people to feel safer again. We're going to wrap up our discussion. I want to thank my guests, Jody Weis, Garry McCarthy, and Eddie Johnson for sharing your experience, your ideas, and for sharing your time with us. That's going to do it for us. From all of us at NBC 5 News, thank you for joining us. Good night.